Dr. Ira Helfand is a past president of Physicians for Social Responsibility, and he's currently the co-president of International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. He's worked for many years as an emergency room physician, and he now practices internal medicine at an urgent care center in Springfield, Massachusetts. He's an expert in nuclear non-proliferation and disarmament. Please give him a warm welcome.
It's a real privilege for me to be able to speak after Jose. The work that MSF does dealing with the problems in the world today is such an inspiration and something that makes me very proud to be a physician. I want to talk to you about something that's a little bit different, though. Nuclear weapons, by and large, are not claiming large numbers of victims on the planet at this moment. But the consequences that will result if they are used, and the likelihood that they will be used, are now so great that I think that even though this is perhaps in a sense only a potential threat to health, it's one of such magnitude that it demands our attention. And in fact, as the slide up there suggests, I would argue that eliminating nuclear weapons has become our highest professional responsibility. Looking around the room here, there are people with hair like mine who I'm sure do remember the Cold War. And at that time, we understood clearly how dangerous nuclear weapons were and what a threat they posed. When the Cold War ended 25 years ago, we all began to act as though this problem had gone away. But it has not. As Andy mentioned this morning, there are still some 15,000 warheads in the world today, nuclear warheads, 1,800 of which are on hair trigger alert. And we have seen over the last year a rapid deterioration in conditions in two parts of the world, which raises the very real threat that nuclear weapons will be used. And so it is critically important that we understand what's going to happen if this does occur. The first area is South Asia, where the situation between India and Pakistan has become increasingly tense. The Indian and Pakistani forces have exchanged gunfire across the line of demarcation in Kashmir on an almost daily basis for the last 2 years. There's been a very worrisome up-ramp of the rhetoric on both sides, with India talking about its plans for its cold start offensive into Pakistan to split the country in two in the event that there's another war between them, and Pakistan indicating very clearly that if there is another war and India invades Pakistan, Pakistan will early on resort to the use of nuclear weapons. So that's one area that we need to be very concerned about. The other, of course, is the confrontation between Russia and NATO, something which we, I think 3 or 4 years ago, thought just couldn't happen again, but it has happened. And both Russia and NATO are rattling nuclear sabers in a very, very frightening way. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all this is the evolution of Russian military doctrine, which now calls for what is referred to as a de-escalatory use of nuclear weapons early in any conflict with NATO. Under this doctrine, what is put forward is that if fighting breaks out between Russia and NATO, nuclear weapons will be used early on, not as a last resort, but early on in an attempt to quickly scare off NATO and end the conflict on terms favorable to Russia. For its part, the US and NATO have frequently made similar threats in the past and basically refused to take the nuclear option off the table whenever there's a conflict that they're involved in. So let's look for a minute at what happens, first of all, with a limited nuclear war between India and Pakistan. The consequences in South Asia of this conflict would be catastrophic. We've looked at a scenario in which each country uses about half of its nuclear arsenal, about 50 relatively small Hiroshima-sized bombs used by each side to attack urban targets in the other country. The consequences locally are catastrophic. Something like 20 million people are killed within a week by the blasts, the fires, the local radiation effects. But the worldwide climate disruption is even more destructive. There is a drop in temperatures around the planet, caused by the soot that gets thrown up into the atmosphere that blocks out the sun. It's about 1.3 degrees centigrade over the entire surface of the planet. And this takes place quickly, like over the course of 2 or 3 days. 1.3 degrees centigrade doesn't necessarily sound like a whole lot, but if you look at this graph, the blue line shows all the global warming that's taken place in the last 130 years that we are so appropriately worried about. The red line shows the change in temperature that takes place in 3 days. And the effect of this is profound on food production. We've been able to look particularly closely at food production in China. And as you can see, maize goes down about 16% over a decade. Rice production goes down about 17%. And wheat production in China goes down by a truly catastrophic 31% for an entire decade. The world simply is not in a position to absorb this kind of decline in food production. And we have looked at what would happen if this happens, because if it happens in China, it's going to happen in Europe, in North America, and the other major food-producing areas of the world as well. At the current moment in the world, grain reserves are very inadequate. They amount to only about 70 days of consumption. There just isn't enough stored grain to deal with this kind of shortfall in production. There are, in addition today, about 810 million people who are already malnourished. These people are getting just enough food to stay alive and do a little bit of physical work. In the event of a limited war in South Asia, or any place else for that matter, this entire group of 810 million people is going to be at risk. There are also about 300 million people in the world today who are well-nourished, but live in countries which are completely dependent on food imports. This includes very wealthy countries like Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, also most of the countries in the Middle East and North Africa. 300 million more people. They also would be at risk. And in addition, there are about 1 billion people in China, get most of their food domestically grown, relatively well-nourished today, but the data shows that China takes a very big hit in the event of this limited nuclear war. And of the 1.3 billion people in China today, about 1 billion have not shared very significantly in China's economic miracle over the last 2 decades. And we believe that a full 2 billion people around the world would be at risk of starvation in the event of this limited nuclear war confined to one small portion of the globe, a war which could take place today or tomorrow. No one would be surprised to wake up tomorrow and learn that fighting had erupted again between India and Pakistan. That's part of the danger. It's not just the Indian and Pakistani forces we need to worry about, though. The weapons on a single Trident submarine can do the same thing. I think British Tridents carry about 48 warheads, most of which are about 10 to 30 times more powerful than the warheads that we used in our scenario looking at South Asian, war in South Asia. That means that each of the Trident submarines in the British fleet is able to produce this same nuclear famine scenario. I believe Britain has 4, the United States has 14. In the case of the United States, this is just a third of our nuclear arsenal, because we also have strategic bombers and we have land-based missiles. So let's look for a minute at what happens if these weapons get used. And I want to start by describing to you the effects of a large-scale nuclear attack on a single city. We all have this image of Hiroshima or Nagasaki. We've seen the pictures. We know how horrible it was. That was one very small bomb. A modern war would involve attacks on cities like London, Moscow, New York, involving not one bomb, but 10 or 15. Most of them would be about 30 to 50 times more powerful than the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. I use a model of a single 20 megaton explosion to try to describe this. The megatonnage is actually a little bit bigger than would probably befall a city like London in a modern attack. The destruction that I'm going to describe for you is actually substantially less than what would happen, because an attack involving many smaller warheads spread out causes more destruction. Within 1,000th of a second of the detonation of this explosive, a fireball would form, reaching out for 2 miles in every direction. 4 miles across. Within this entire area, the temperature would rise to 20 million degrees Fahrenheit, and everything would be vaporized. The Earth itself, the upper level of the Earth, would simply disappear. The buildings, the people, the trees, everything would be gone. To a distance of 4 miles in every direction, the explosion would generate winds greater than 600 miles per hour and blast pressures greater than 25 pounds per square inch. Mechanical forces of that magnitude can destroy anything that human beings can build. To a distance of 6 miles in every direction, the heat would be so intense that automobiles would melt. And to a distance of 16 miles in every direction, this goes out to the M25 Beltway, the heat would be so intense that everything flammable would burn. Paper, cloth, wood, heating oil, gasoline, plastic, it all ignites, causing hundreds of thousands of fires, which over the next half hour coalesce into a giant firestorm, 32 miles across, covering over 800 square miles. Within this entire area, the temperature rises to 1400 degrees Fahrenheit. All of the oxygen is consumed, and every living thing dies. In the case of London, we're talking about some 10 million people dead in a half an hour. And if this were part of a large-scale war between NATO and Russia, this same level of destruction would be visited on every major city in Russia, in the United States, in Canada, and most of the great cities of Europe. A study that we did about 12 years ago looked at the effects of just 300 of the 1,500 warheads that the Russians have getting through targets in the United States. It was an American study. We showed that in the first half hour, 75 to 100 million people would die. In addition, the entire economic infrastructure of the country, everything that we rely on to keep our population alive, would be destroyed. The banking system, the public health system, the food distribution system, the electric grid, the web, it would all be gone. And in the months following this attack, the vast majority of the population who did not die promptly would die from starvation, from exposure, from epidemic disease. All told, the direct casualties from this conflict would be something on the order of 1 billion people. But as was the case with the limited war in South Asia, this is not the whole problem, because the war in South Asia puts about 5 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere. A war between Russia and NATO using just those weapons, which are going to still be allowed to these countries when the New START Treaty is fully implemented in 2017, that war puts 150 million tons of soot into the upper atmosphere. And it drops temperatures not 1.3 degrees centigrade, but an average of 8 degrees centigrade across the entire planet. In the interior regions of North America and Eurasia, the temperatures drop by 25 to 30 degrees centigrade. We have not seen conditions on this planet that cold in 18,000 years, since the coldest moment of the last ice age. In the Northern Hemisphere, there would be 3 years, during which every single day, at some point in the day, the temperature would go below freezing. That means that the ecosystems across the hemisphere would collapse. Food production would stop. The vast majority of the human race would starve to death, for certain. And it is possible that we would become extinct as a species. This is not just a nightmare I've cooked up to ruin your day. This is what is going to happen if these weapons are used. And the leaders on both sides of the new divide between East and West talk with a horrifying casualness about using these weapons. So, why am I talking to you about this? Because this is not the future that must be, even though it is the future that will be if we don't take action. And so it is incumbent on us to do that. And as medical professionals, we have, I think, a very special responsibility to act on this issue. We speak as the authoritative voice on public health questions. We speak from a body of scientific data that has been generated by the medical profession over the last 50 years. And that voice, if raised, carries an enormous amount of weight. Unfortunately, we haven't been making that voice very well heard. As an editorial in The Lancet in 2010 said, it is over a decade now since The Lancet published anything remotely relevant to nuclear weapons as a threat to health. Such complacency has been a serious error. Now is the moment for physicians and scientists to build new opportunities for political progress to diffuse the danger of a new and more regionally focused nuclear arms race. About the same time, a group of deans of medical schools and schools of public health in the United States issued their own statement saying, "We call on our colleagues in the medical and public health communities to educate their colleagues, their patients, and their communities about the enormous danger we face as long as these weapons exist." We have taken, as a community, the medical profession has taken this up somewhat. The World Medical Association just last month passed a powerful resolution at its meeting in Moscow, calling for the abolition of all nuclear weapons and calling for medical societies around the world to undertake educational activity to bring this message to our patients and to the general public and to decision makers. And we have to understand that when we do this, we can, and in fact in the past have had, an enormous impact. This is a quote from Mikhail Gorbachev, speaking about the work that IPPNW did in the 1980s. Their work commands great respect, and I'm losing this here, for what they say and what they do is prompted by accurate knowledge and a passionate desire to warn humanity. There seems to be no room left for politicking, and no serious politician has the right to disregard their conclusions. Gorbachev says that it is the information given to him by physicians that fundamentally changed his thinking about nuclear weapons and led him to take the steps that he did in the mid-1980s, which stopped the arms race, the Cold War arms race, and led to the huge reductions in nuclear weapons that took place, and almost brought us to the abolition of nuclear weapons. But we didn't quite get there. We still have an enormous job to do, and we have the ability to do that. There is a new movement around the world, inspired by this medical message about the consequences of nuclear weaponry, that is calling for a new treaty to ban and abolish these weapons. IPPNW has started a new umbrella organization, the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which has grown enormously over the last few years and has really mobilized civil society to a degree that has not been seen since the Cold War. But there's a great deal more to do. If I can speak for just a minute to the young people in this audience, I have done something, I think, fairly terrible to you all today, assuming that much of this information was not known to you before, because it is not generally well known in our society at the moment. And by sharing this with you, I have put a terrible burden on your shoulders, because once you know about this danger, you have a responsibility to act on this information and to do something about it. And I feel bad about that, because you had nothing to do with creating this problem, and in that very important sense, you're not responsible for this. But in a much more important sense, you are responsible, because if you and me and people like us don't take action, all the things which I have described today are going to take place. And everything that we love and cherish in this world is going to be destroyed. And so you have a huge responsibility, and it is a burden, and it's going to be with you until we get rid of these weapons. One last thing, in looking at this, I think it's not just a burden. This is also something of a gift which I'm offering to you. Every one of you wants to do something good with your life. You have the opportunity to save the world, and that is a very good thing to do.